The War of 1812 was a pivotal crucible that forged America's identity as a nation. It sparked a chain reaction of events that would reshape the continent and redefine the young republic's place in the world. Join me on a journey through the fiery trials of this forgotten war, where heroism and tragedy collide in a struggle that still echoes today. As the Napoleonic Wars raged across Europe, the United States found itself increasingly entangled in the conflict, despite its official stance of neutrality. The British Navy, with its unparalleled dominance of the seas, began to exert its influence over American shipping, seizing vessels and cargo that it deemed to be in contravention of its trade restrictions. This flagrant disregard for American sovereignty was compounded by the practice of impressment, where British naval officers would board American ships and forcibly conscript sailors into their own service, often on the flimsiest of pretexts. The outrage this sparked among Americans was palpable, with many regarding it as a gross affront to their nation's honor and a blatant infringement of their rights as citizens. The impressment of American sailors was not merely a theoretical concern, it had real-world consequences that resonated deeply with the public. For instance, the USS Chesapeake incident in 1807, where the British warship HMS Leopard fired on an American vessel, killing and wounding several crew members, before proceeding to impress 4 sailors, ignited widespread indignation and calls for action against the British. This event, more than any other, brought home the reality of British depredations on the high seas and galvanized opposition to their actions. In response to these provocations, the American government turned to economic warfare as a means of exerting pressure on both Britain and France. The Embargo Act of 1807, which prohibited all exports from the United States, was intended to cripple the economies of both belligerents by denying them access to vital American goods. However, this policy ultimately proved disastrous for the American economy, leading to widespread unemployment, business failures, and a significant decline in government revenue. The subsequent Non-Intercourse Act of 1809, which allowed trade with all nations except Britain and France, was an attempt to mitigate these effects, but it too failed to achieve its objectives, and the American economy continued to suffer. Meanwhile, on the western frontier, tensions were rising as Native American tribes, led by the visionary leader Tecumseh, began to resist American expansion. Tecumseh's Confederacy, a loose alliance of indigenous peoples stretching from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, posed a significant challenge to American authority in the region. As American settlers pushed westward, encroaching on Native American lands and threatening their way of life, Tecumseh and his brother, the Prophet, emerged as powerful voices advocating for resistance against the invaders. The Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811, where American forces under William Henry Harrison clashed with Tecumseh's warriors, marked a turning point in this struggle, as it not only highlighted the growing militancy of Native American tribes, but also underscored the increasingly precarious nature of American relations with its indigenous population. As the Battle of Tippecanoe faded into memory, its consequences continued to reverberate across the American frontier. The clash between Harrison's forces and Tecumseh's warriors had not only highlighted the deepening rift between Native Americans and the United States, but also galvanized a growing faction in Congress known as the Warhawks. These ardent nationalists, led by figures such as Henry Clay and John Calhoun, saw the British as the primary instigators of Native American resistance and believed that a war with Britain was necessary to assert American sovereignty and expand its territory. The Warhawks' rhetoric found fertile ground among many Americans who were increasingly frustrated with British impressment, trade restrictions, and perceived support for Native American militancy. As tensions escalated, frontier violence continued to simmer, with skirmishes and raids occurring along the border between American settlements and Native American territories. The killing of several American settlers by Native American warriors in the spring of 1812, for example, sparked outrage and further fueled the Warhawks' demands for action against Britain. In June 1812, President James Madison, who had long been sympathetic to the Warhawks' views, submitted a war message to Congress. In it, he cataloged the grievances against Britain, including impressment, trade restrictions, and support for Native American resistance, and called upon lawmakers to authorize military action. The congressional debates that followed were intense and often acrimonious, with opponents of war, such as Federalist Representative Josiah Quincy, arguing that the country was unprepared for conflict and that the costs would be catastrophic. Despite these reservations, the Warhawks ultimately carried the day, and on June 18, 1812, Congress declared war on Britain. The vote was far from unanimous, with 79 representatives voting in favor of war and 49 opposed. As the news of the declaration spread, Americans reacted with a mix of enthusiasm and trepidation. While many saw the war as a necessary step to assert national honor and sovereignty, others feared the consequences of taking on the mighty British Empire. As it turned out, America's military was woefully unprepared for the conflict that lay ahead. The army, which had been allowed to atrophy since the Revolution, numbered only around 600–700 regular troops, with many more militia forces available but poorly trained and equipped. The Navy, meanwhile, boasted a mere 16 ships, none of which could match the firepower of British warships. Despite these weaknesses, American leaders were confident that their forces could prevail, particularly if they could mobilize the support of Native American tribes and exploit the divisions within the British Empire. As the summer of 1812 wore on, American forces launched a series of ill-fated invasions of Canada, hoping to capture key territories and weaken British control. One of the most disastrous of these incursions was led by General William Hull, who marched a force of approximately 2,500 troops into Upper Canada with the goal of capturing the strategic town of Malden. However, Hull's campaign was plagued by poor planning, inadequate supplies, and a lack of intelligence on British dispositions. On August 16, 1812, Hull's forces were confronted by a combined force of British regulars, Canadian militia, and Native American warriors under the command of General Isaac Brock in Tecumseh. After a brief skirmish, Hull requested a parley with Brock, during which he was persuaded to surrender his entire army, citing concerns for the safety of the civilian population in Detroit. The surrender at Detroit was a devastating blow to American morale and prestige, as it not only handed the British control of a key fort and town, but also gave them access to the strategic waterways of the Great Lakes. However, American naval forces on the lakes were beginning to assert themselves, scoring several important victories that would help to offset the losses suffered by Hull's army. On September 10, 1812, the USS Scorpion, a small schooner commanded by Lieutenant Johann Cushing, engaged and captured the British sloop HMS Lady Prevost on Lake Erie, marking one of the first American naval victories of the war. Meanwhile, on the high seas, the USS Constitution, one of the 6 original frigates built for the United States Navy, was making a name for itself as a formidable opponent of British warships. On August 19, 1812, the Constitution, commanded by Captain Isaac Hull, encountered the HMS Guerriere, a 38-gun British frigate, off the coast of Nova Scotia. The two ships engaged in a fierce and closely contested battle, with the Constitution ultimately emerging victorious after the Guerriere's mast was shot away and she was forced to strike her colors. This stunning upset, in which an American ship had defeated a larger and more heavily armed British opponent, sent shockwaves through the naval community and earned the USS Constitution the nickname Old Ironsides. The success of the USS Constitution against the HMS Guerriere was not an isolated incident, as other American warships were also beginning to score victories against their British counterparts. On September 5, 1812, the USS Wasp, a small sloop commanded by Master Commandant Jacob Jones, captured the HMS Avon, a British brig, off the coast of Virginia, while on October 12, 1812, the USS United States, a 44-gun American frigate, defeated the HMS Macedonian, a 38-gun British frigate, in a battle fought off the coast of Madeira. These early naval triumphs helped to counterbalance the setbacks suffered by American forces on land and provided a much-needed boost to national morale. As the winter of 1812 to 1813 drew to a close, American forces began to regroup and reassess their strategy for the upcoming campaign season. One of the key objectives was to capture the Canadian capital, York, now Toronto, which was seen as a vital prize in the war. On April 27, 1813, a force of approximately 1,700 American troops, led by General Henry Dearborn and Brigadier General Zebulon Pike, set sail from Sackett's Harbor, New York, bound for York. The Americans landed on the outskirts of the city and quickly overran the British defenses, forcing the garrison to retreat. In the ensuing chaos, the American troops accidentally set fire to the Canadian Parliament buildings, which burned to the ground, along with several other key structures in the city. The burning of York was a significant blow to British morale and prestige, but it also marked a turning point in the war on the Great Lakes. As the Americans consolidated their hold on Lake Ontario, they began to shift their attention to Lake Erie, where the British had established a strong presence. On June 10, 1813, American forces under the command of Oliver Hazard Perry set sail from Presque Isle, now Erie, Pennsylvania, bound for the western end of the lake. Perry's fleet consisted of 9 ships, including the USS Lawrence and the USS Niagara, which were to play a crucial role in the upcoming battle. On September 10, 1813, Perry's fleet encountered a British squadron of 6 ships led by Commander Robert Harriet Barclay off the coast of Put-in Bay, Ohio. The Battle of Lake Erie was fierce and intense, with both sides suffering heavy damage and casualties. However, Perry's clever tactics and the superior gunnery of his crews ultimately proved decisive, as the British ships were forced to surrender. The American victory on Lake Erie had far-reaching consequences, not least of which was the death of the Native American leader Tecumseh at the Battle of the Thames on October 5, 1813. Tecumseh, who had allied himself with the British in the hope of resisting American expansion, was killed in action during a skirmish with American troops led by General William Henry Harrison. The loss of Tecumseh was a devastating blow to Native American resistance, and it marked a significant shift in the balance of power on the northwest frontier. Meanwhile, in the southeastern United States, a separate conflict was unfolding. The Creek War, which had begun in 1812, pitted American forces against the Creek Nation, a powerful and influential tribe that controlled much of present-day Alabama and Georgia. In 1813, Andrew Jackson, a young and ambitious officer from Tennessee, emerged as a key leader in the war. Jackson's military campaigns against the Creeks were marked by brutality and cunning, as he sought to crush the tribe's resistance and open up their lands to American settlement. On March 27, 1813, Jackson's forces defeated a large Creek army at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, which marked a decisive turning point in the war. The Creeks were ultimately forced to cede millions of acres of land to the United States, paving the way for American expansion into the region. As the Creek War drew to a close, a significant shift in the global balance of power was underway. The Napoleonic Wars, which had consumed Europe for over a decade, finally came to an end with Napoleon's abdication in April 1814. With the French threat neutralized, Britain was now free to redirect its attention and resources towards the American theater. The British government, seeking to capitalize on this newfound freedom of action, began to formulate plans for a comprehensive campaign against the United States. In the summer of 1814, a large British army, led by General Robert Ross, set sail from Bermuda bound for the Chesapeake Bay. The British objective was to launch a 3-pronged attack on American territory, with simultaneous assaults on Baltimore, Washington, and New Orleans. The British strategy aimed to divide American forces, create chaos, and ultimately force the United States to negotiate a favorable peace treaty. On August 24, 1814, British troops landed at Benedict, Maryland, and began their march towards Washington. The American capital, poorly defended and largely unprepared for an attack of this scale, was quickly overrun. British soldiers, fueled by a desire for revenge against the Americans, proceeded to burn and pillage large portions of the city, including the White House, the Capitol building, and other key government structures. The burning of Washington, as it came to be known, was a devastating blow to American morale and prestige. As the British continued their advance, they set their sights on Baltimore, a strategic port city and a crucial hub for American trade and commerce. On September 12, 1814, British forces launched a massive assault on the city's defenses, but were repelled by a determined American garrison. The Battle of Baltimore, fought on land and sea, was one of the most intense and pivotal engagements of the war. As the British fleet bombarded the city's fortifications, an American lawyer named Francis Scott Key, who had been negotiating the release of American prisoners from British custody, watched in awe as the American flag continued to wave above Fort McHenry despite the withering bombardment. Inspired by this moment of defiance and patriotism, Key penned a poem, later set to music, which would become the iconic "The Star-Spangled Banner." The poem's stirring lyrics, which celebrated the bravery and resilience of the American people, would go on to become an enduring symbol of American identity and national pride. As the British withdrew from Baltimore, their plans for a three-pronged attack were beginning to unravel. Although they would eventually launch a successful assault on New Orleans in December 1814, the failure to capture Baltimore and the symbolic significance of the American victory would ultimately contribute to the signing of the Treaty of Ghent, which would bring an end to the war on December 24, 1814. As the British withdrew from Baltimore, their attention turned to the northern frontier, where a series of pivotal battles would shape the outcome of the war. In July 1814, American forces under General Jacob Brown launched a campaign to drive the British from Upper Canada. The first major engagement took place on July 5, 1814, at the Battle of Chippewa, where American troops clashed with a British army led by General Phineas Riall. The Americans emerged victorious, thanks in part to their effective use of artillery and the bravery of the 1st Brigade, which charged into the fray with bayonets fixed. The British regrouped and counterattacked on July 25, 1814, at the Battle of Lundy's Lane, one of the bloodiest battles of the war. The fighting was intense, with both sides suffering heavy casualties as they exchanged volleys and artillery fire. Although the Americans ultimately held their ground, the British had inflicted significant damage, and General Brown was forced to withdraw his troops to regroup and tend to the wounded. As the American army retreated, they established a strong defensive position at Fort Erie, which controlled access to the Niagara River. The British, determined to capture the fort, launched a siege in August 1814. The Americans, however, had prepared extensively for this eventuality, constructing a complex network of trenches and earthworks that allowed them to withstand the British bombardment. Despite being outnumbered, the American garrison held firm, repelling repeated British assaults and eventually forcing the enemy to lift the siege. Meanwhile, on Lake Champlain, a series of naval battles raged as American and British squadrons clashed for control of the waterway. On September 11, 1814, the American fleet under Commander Thomas MacDonough engaged the British at the Battle of Plattsburgh Bay. The Americans had carefully prepared their defenses, anchoring their ships in a strong position that allowed them to rake the British with broadsides. The British, however, were undaunted, and a fierce battle ensued as the two fleets exchanged cannon fire. As the battle reached its climax, Macdonough's flagship, the USS Saratoga, found itself surrounded by British vessels. In a daring maneuver, Macdonough ordered his crew to turn the ship, bringing its fresh broadside to bear on the enemy. The British were caught off guard, and their ships were quickly overwhelmed. The American victory at Plattsburgh Bay was decisive, forcing the British to abandon their plans for an invasion of New York State. With their naval superiority broken, the British Army under General Sir George Prevost began a retreat from Plattsburgh, abandoning their positions on the northern frontier. As they withdrew, the Americans pursued, harassing their rear guard and further weakening their already battered forces. The British defeat at Plattsburgh marked a significant turning point in the war, as it thwarted their plans for a comprehensive campaign against the United States and set the stage for the eventual signing of the Treaty of Ghent. As the British withdrew from Plattsburgh, their attention turned to the Gulf Coast, where a large invasion force had been assembling under the command of General Sir Edward Pakenham. The British objective was to capture the strategic port city of New Orleans, which controlled access to the Mississippi River and the vast territories beyond. In December 1814, a British fleet sailed into the Gulf of Mexico, carrying over 8,000 troops, and began to disembark at Lake Borgne, about 30 miles east of New Orleans. Meanwhile, Andrew Jackson, who had been appointed commander of the 7th Military District, was busily preparing the city's defenses. Jackson, a seasoned military leader with a reputation for tenacity and cunning, knew that the British would likely attempt to attack via the lake and the nearby bayous. He set about fortifying the city's perimeter, constructing earthworks and trenches along the Rodriguez Canal, which ran from the Mississippi River to the swampy terrain of the Bayou Bienvenue. Jackson also mobilized a diverse force of militiamen, regular army troops, pirates, and volunteers, including African Americans and Native Americans, to defend the city. On January 8, 1815, the British launched a massive assault on the American lines, with Pakenham's troops advancing in columns across the open fields before the Rodriguez Canal. However, Jackson's defenders were well entrenched and waiting. As the British approached, they were cut down by withering artillery fire and volleys of musketry from the American lines. The British suffered horrific casualties, with over 2,000 killed or wounded, including General Pakenham, who was fatally shot in the battle. In contrast, the Americans lost fewer than 100 men. The Battle of New Orleans was a decisive American victory, one that would go down in history as one of the greatest defensive battles ever fought. However, in a curious twist of fate, news of the battle did not reach Washington until after the Treaty of Ghent had been signed on December 24, 1814, officially ending the War of 1812. The treaty had been ratified by the British government, but the slow pace of communication across the Atlantic meant that the news had not yet reached American shores. As a result, the Battle of New Orleans was fought in a kind of historical limbo, with both sides unaware that the war was already technically over. As the Battle of New Orleans was being fought, unbeknownst to the combatants, a different kind of battle had already been won in Europe. The peace negotiations that had begun in August 1814 at Ghent, Belgium, had finally borne fruit on December 24, 1814, with the signing of the Treaty of Ghent. This treaty marked the official end of the War of 1812, bringing to a close 2.5 years of conflict between the United States and the British Empire. The negotiations at Ghent had been a complex and often contentious process, with both sides digging in their heels over various issues. The American delegation, led by Henry Clay, James Bayard, Albert Gallatin, James Russell, and Jonathan Russell, had initially taken a hardline stance, demanding significant concessions from the British, including the abandonment of impressment of American sailors and the withdrawal of British support for Native American resistance against American expansion. However, as the talks progressed, it became clear that neither side was willing to yield on these key issues. Ultimately, the treaty that emerged represented a series of compromises, with both sides agreeing to return to the status quo ante bellum, the state of affairs as they existed before the war. This meant that all conquered territory would be returned, and trade relations would resume as if the war had never occurred. The British agreed to abandon their claims to any territory in North America, while the Americans dropped their demands for British withdrawal from Canada. One of the most significant aspects of the treaty was its failure to address any of the main issues that had led to the war in the first place. Impressment, trade restrictions, and British support for Native American resistance were all left untouched, leaving many Americans feeling that the war had been fought for nothing. However, the treaty did establish a commission to settle border disputes between the United States and British North America, now Canada, which would go on to play an important role in shaping the future of North American relations. As the news of the treaty signing made its way across the Atlantic, it was delayed by the slow pace of communication. The British government had ratified the treaty on December 30, 1814, but it would take several weeks for the news to reach America. In the meantime, the Battle of New Orleans had been fought and won, and Andrew Jackson's victory had already become a celebrated event in American history. It wasn't until February 11, 1815, that the news of the Treaty of Ghent finally reached Washington, D.C., where it was greeted with a mix of relief and disappointment. Many Americans felt that the war had been unnecessary and that the treaty did not adequately address the grievances that had led to the conflict. However, others saw the treaty as a necessary step towards restoring peace and stability, and towards rebuilding the American economy, which had suffered significantly during the war. As the news of the Treaty of Ghent spread throughout the United States, a sense of relief and optimism washed over the nation. The era of good feelings, which had begun during the war, continued to gain momentum, with growing nationalism and a renewed sense of American identity. The country was poised for a period of unprecedented growth and expansion, with many Americans eager to put the conflicts of the past behind them and look towards a brighter future. One of the first significant consequences of the Treaty of Ghent was the Rush-Bagot Agreement, signed on April 28, 1817. This agreement demilitarized the Great Lakes, establishing a border between the United States and British North America that would be patrolled by only a few small vessels. The agreement marked a significant shift in American foreign policy, as it demonstrated a willingness to compromise and cooperate with Britain, rather than relying on military might to resolve disputes. As the United States began to expand westward, Native American tribes found themselves increasingly under pressure. The Treaty of Ghent had not addressed the issue of British support for Native American resistance, but the Rush-Bagot Agreement helped to reduce tensions in the region. However, the growing tide of American expansionism would soon lead to further conflicts with Native American tribes. The Creek War, fought from 1813 to 1814, had already led to the forced relocation of many Creek Indians from their ancestral lands in Georgia and Alabama. Similar conflicts would continue to erupt throughout the 1810s and 1820s, as the United States government sought to expand its territory and assert its authority over Native American tribes. Despite these challenges, the era of good feelings continued to shape American politics and society. In 1816, James Monroe was elected president, running on a platform of nationalism and expansionism. Monroe's presidency would be marked by significant events, including the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which admitted Missouri as a slave state and banned slavery in the Louisiana Territory north of the 36-30s parallel. This compromise helped to temporarily ease tensions over the issue of slavery, but it also set a precedent for future debates over the expansion of slavery into new territories. In 1823, Monroe delivered his famous message to Congress, which would come to be known as the Monroe Doctrine. In this speech, Monroe asserted that the United States would not tolerate further European colonization in the Americas, and that any attempts to do so would be met with American opposition. The Monroe Doctrine marked a significant evolution in American foreign policy, as it established the United States as a protector of the Western Hemisphere and a guardian of democratic values. The implications of the Monroe Doctrine were far-reaching and would shape American foreign policy for decades to come. It marked a significant shift away from the isolationism of the early American Republic and towards a more assertive and interventionist approach to international relations. As the United States continued to expand its territory and influence, it would find itself increasingly drawn into conflicts with European powers and would begin to assert its own claims to territory and resources in the Western Hemisphere. The War of 1812 was a pivotal moment in American history, marking a turning point in the nation's development from a fledgling republic to a confident world power. The conflict tested the young country's resolve, forced it to confront its vulnerabilities, and ultimately emerge stronger and more united than ever before. As we reflect on the war's legacy, we are reminded that the true strength of a nation lies not in its military might, but in its ability to persevere, adapt, and evolve in the face of adversity. The War of 1812 may be a forgotten conflict to some, but its impact on American identity, foreign policy, and national character continues to reverberate to this day. Thank you for joining me on this journey through military history. Until next time, I'm General Biography, reminding you to keep marching toward victory.